one of the people I know best and appreciate that. But when you introduce yourself, it's like, yeah, so I'm the greatest speaker. But I just give you my background. I have a Ph.D. in physics from Duke University. And after I finished my Ph.D., I went into actually the ministry role. I did a lot of work with students and helping them think about how faith integrates with their profession. And I also did a lot of work with faith and science. More at a popular level. I'm more of a translator. I like to take what the super brilliant people do and then translate that to the general public. It's kind of my role. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the issue of faith and science. And I'll begin with my story. And just as a sense, who was here when I spoke on Thursday? So we have about half and half. What I'll do then is I've sort of switched up my material to make it interesting for the people that were here on Thursday. So the first part will be the same. We'll do the same material, which hopefully will be enjoyable for everyone. But what I'll do is I'll first talk a little bit about the issue of faith and science and how people approach it. Then I'll deal with why it's important to understand how to approach it. Then I'll talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty faith-science intersections, particularly the issue of cosmology, biology, and then for a special extra DVD treat, I'll talk about the Shroud of Turin if you've got a little bit extra time. So that's going to be kind of what I'm talking about. So just to give you a sense of why it's important to me is I grew up Catholic actually. Anyone raised Catholic? You people, yeah. And then for me, it was much more of a cultural experience. But after the summer of my senior year, I read through the New Testament for the first time in its entirety. I had a really powerful experience with God. It was like God was speaking to me, not in the kind of kooky sense of voices, but more in the sense of the transcendent that God was really part of my life. And it was really dramatic. And I went to MIT for undergraduate and went through a huge faith crisis. Part of it was I read Richard Dawkins, actually, let me grab my props. I think I'll put my props here. Ah, perfect. Thank you.
Trader Joe Bruce.
That's right. It's kind of tough on the science. You have to understand. We just have to get to you with what we can. But I read The Blind Watchmaker. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's by Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is sort of the equivalent of Jerry Falwell in the atheist world. So he's a very passionate preacher of atheism, very, very aggressive. So this book basically is arguing that when you look at nature and you see design, it's just an illusion, and it just simply is blind chance. And we're alone in the universe, so that's just the way it is. So I read this book and also took a Bible class from a very secular perspective and became pretty convinced that Christianity was just a psychological crutch. I felt that religious people were just sort of deluding themselves. And it was really kind of very disorienting because I wanted to really commit my life to serving God, but then if God didn't exist, that would be very inconvenient. So I remember just praying and saying, God, if you exist, I'm not sure if you're up there, but if you do exist, you have to show me what's true, or else I just can't do this. I'm a science guy, and that's just kind of the way it is. So I didn't think that was a really fair question for me to ask, but over the years I went through a bit of a journey, which was both intellectual and both spiritual. So the intellectual part was dealing with the issue of faith and science, the historicity of the New Testament, miracles, some anthropology, psychology, et cetera. And part of it was really spiritual in the sense that I became part of a very passionate community for Christ in Durham, North Carolina. Any North Carolina people? Probably not. So that's okay. Where'd you guys go? Oh, okay. Okay. I was in the RDU area all the time. And what happened, though, when I was there is my church really embodied the truth of God in some amazing ways. So it was both an intellectual quest and a spiritual quest that really brought me back to Christ. And then I've done these presentations in various venues, largely universities and churches. So that's a little bit of my background. But one of the issues we want to talk about is the issue of faith and science. Let's go to the next slide. Because often people have this perception that there's this hopeless conflict between faith and science. If you ask anybody about faith and science, they immediately think of Galileo. Because remember Galileo back in the old days? The Catholic Church at that time believed that the Earth was the center of the universe, and a lot of that was because of Aquinas. Aquinas had a massive influence in both the church and the culture at that time. And Aquinas really embraced the Ptolemaic view of the universe, where the Earth was the center. So what happened was Galileo said, well, no, that's not right. We can kind of see through this telescope that actually the Earth is not the center, but the sun is of our solar system. And there was a huge conflict, obviously. And what happened is eventually the science won out. And the portrayal is that science is the enlightening force of the world, and religion is trying to suppress truth. That's the picture. And that's many people's perspective, which isn't entirely true, which is what I'm going to talk about. Let's go to the next slide. That's sort of the Ptolemaic view of the Earth being at the center. Next. And of course, this idea of this conflict has been capitalized by what are called the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins, Hitchens, all these folks, if you're familiar with them. And again, Dawkins argues in his book, in several of his books, such as The God Delusion, that science is a universal acid that dissolves away faith. That's his perspective. And the new atheists are trying to use science as a club to beat anyone who's religious until they submit to their more enlightened view of the world. That's their perspective. Next. However, this is not simply a view that a lot of scientists have. Also, Christians often have the sense that faith and science are hopelessly at odds with each other. And you see the movie Inherit the Wind? Yeah, Inherit the Wind was based on what's called the Scopes monkey trial. And back in Dayton, Tennessee, in the earlier part of our century, what happened was it was actually illegal to teach evolution in Tennessee. And there was a test case set up by the ACLU with a guy named Scopes, who actually wasn't even a biology teacher, but he taught evolution, was arrested, and it went to trial. And what happened is this trial became publicity around the world. And at that point, faith was portrayed as ignorant, superstitious, while science was shown to be the power of enlightenment. So really, the Scopes trial was a turning point in American culture, where before that time, particularly the 1800s, faith and science were seen as going hand in hand. In fact, most Christians in the 1800s felt that science was one of the most powerful evidences for God. With the Scopes monkey trial, that completely changed, and the conflict metaphor became almost completely accepted in our culture, even by Christians. In fact, this is a slide. Any of you heard of the Institute of Creation Research, or the Creation? Are you familiar with creationism? Yeah, okay, good. And I'm like, it's such a different. Doing the South versus the North is like the world. It's like in the South, I'm always getting questions like, "Were there dinosaurs on the Ark?" You know, it's just like totally different. In the North, it's like, "You believe in God? Are you crazy?" You know, it's just, so I have to know who I'm speaking to. But you're a very nice church, so I feel safe. Because usually I get hit from both sides at the same time. But this is a picture by what's called the Creation Science Research. And they have very much this metaphor of faith against science, more in the sense that, I'll explain that more, but here's a picture of the idea of creationism based on Christ, and you see the evolutionists that are blasting away at the foundation. And here you see this picture of evolution, and of course below the tagline is Satan, so he kind of reveals their perspective on it. And the sense that there's this war going on between secular science and faithful Christians. Next slide. And what you see is this perspective that if you're a Christian, you have to look at science through the lens of the Bible. While if you're a secular person, you look at science through the lens of atheistic evolutionary theory. And when they say the Bible, there's a very specific way they look at the Bible. It's very literalistic. You've heard terms like inerrancy, those sorts of things if you're in those backgrounds. And the idea is that you have to look at the Bible, read it literally, and interpret it along those lines. So in Genesis 1, it talks about the days of creation, and all the way 1 through 2 and so forth. It talks about day 1, God did this, day 2, did this. The belief is that's literal 24-hour days, about 6,000 years ago. In fact, there's a guy named Bishop Ussher that actually calculated, based on the genealogies, the exact day that creation took place. It was about 4000 BC, I think around 9 o'clock in the morning. I don't know if it was a Thursday, but it was something like that. At any rate, that's the way people approached it. And a lot of the reason for that, and by the way, this is very, very popular in the South. Like, there's a shocking percentage of people that believe the Earth was created 6,000 years ago. I mean, it really is amazing. And what's the reason for that is during the Enlightenment, you've all studied the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, all that sort of stuff. I love talking about that. It's just fantastic. Episcopalians, it's really, yeah, it's cool. The Enlightenment, what are you talking about? It's just a different world, different priorities in education. So what happened in the Enlightenment was the idea that truth is objective, and I'll get into this a lot more in just a moment. But the idea was that objectivity and reason were very important. So what happened also, if you remember the Reformation, of course you do, what happened was the Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church. And you know the Catholics had like 1,500 years of history, right? So the Protestants said there must be something else we have to base our faith on, and it was the Bible. So that's the idea of sola scriptura, only the Bible, or at least the primacy of the Bible. Because you have to have some objective point of reference, and that reference was Scripture. Therefore, you have to have a view of inerrancy. because they felt if there was even one detail wrong in the Bible, that foundation would collapse. Now, as Episcopalians, it doesn't make sense because Episcopalians have the idea of Scripture through history and all that. But if you're in more of that post-Enlightenment Protestantism, that's the way it works. So there's a horrible battle still going on with people trying to argue that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and that anyone that thinks otherwise is a heretic. And the idea is that science has to be seen in this lens. In fact, you have this whole scientific enterprise that tries to argue that the fossil record is simply the product of the flood in Genesis, and it's called flood geology. Now, needless to say, it's kind of hard to fit with actual science, but they do the best they can. It's really, really interesting. Next. Now, that's one approach. It's a conflict approach. Another approach is called the harmonizing approach. And this is one of the proponents of this is a guy named Hugh Ross. I've actually met him. He's a very pleasant fellow. Of course, I'm biased. He's a Ph.D. in physics, but and he's actually a cosmologist. What he's trying to do is argue that you can still take the Bible literally, but you simply have to understand it in its context. So he would argue that the days of Genesis, of creation, are literal, but they're not literal 24-hour days. He argues the word yom can mean long periods of time. So he tries to take each day of Genesis and fit it to a real astronomical event, like where it says, let there be light, is like the Big Bang. The day of the sun, moon, and stars, like when the atmosphere became transparent, so you can see the sun, moon, and stars. So he's trying to link it each day literally. And of course, the creationists despise this man. I mean, there is such a bitter feud between these guys. It gets really, really ugly. So he's nicer, but I'm biased because he's a good guy. But anyway, that's kind of the harmonizing approach. Next slide. Now, another approach coined by a guy named Stephen Jay Gould, who's a deceased paleontologist, used to be a professor at Harvard, is called non-overlapping magisterium. What that means is that science asks one set of questions, like how do things work? Faith asks another set of questions, like what is meaning, morality, all that sort of thing. So the two are completely different enterprises. So there's no conflict because they don't address the same issues. That's called the non-overlapping magisterium. Now, it's problematic in the sense that usually people that promote this believe that science should be privatized, or faith should be privatized. So what they're really saying is we'll tolerate your beliefs as long as they're private, but you don't try to promote your ideas outside your churches. So that's usually what happens in this perspective. So it sounds good at first, but when you start to really flesh things out, it can be more problematic. It's very problematic, too, when you start dealing with issues of ethics in science, like eugenics. So you have to realize that the two do speak to each other in very important ways, which we'll get to. Next slide. Now this is an approach I like. It's called the interdependent approach, and this is a famous quote by Albert Einstein. He said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." And Einstein was not a traditional Jew. He was Jewish, but he was not like an Orthodox Jew. He had a view of religion which was a bit more abstract, almost a bit more, a little bit more deistic, but nevertheless, he still had the understanding that science cannot be done in a vacuum. There has to be higher authorities that speak into it. And obviously, because he was during the time of the Holocaust, that makes a lot of sense from that perspective. Next slide. And here's the real distinction, is faith and science will overlap. It's like two spheres, or two interlocking circles. There's a place where they overlap in terms of what they're addressing, but they address the same things from different angles. So faith, the Bible, speaks about science in the terms of myth. And I don't mean myth pejoratively or condescendingly. I mean myth in terms of stories which represent larger truths. So while Genesis talks about creation in terms of the narrative of Adam and Eve, what happens is science talks about creation in the language of mathematics. So they're speaking about the same things, but there's a different language, a different accent, a different emphasis. So they overlap and can speak to each other, but the focus is different, and that's important. Because if you look at Genesis, you have to understand, and I'm sure you do actually, is that the culture was very different than modern scientific culture. So when you have whoever wrote, whether it was Moses or a scribe later, whoever wrote about Genesis, he wrote it in the language and context that the people of that time understood. There's lots of overlaps with like the Egyptian mythology and other mythology at that time, but it presents true theology and challenges the views of the myths of that time period. There's also lots of neat connections with Exodus, which I can't get into. Well, one cool, a few. If you think about it, if you take a very conservative view on the writing of Exodus and Genesis, Moses would be the source. And what was Moses concerned about, right? Going from Egypt into Israel, right? So what do you see in creation? Remember how the Spirit hovered above the waters of creation? Exodus talks about the Spirit hovering above Israel. Remember, what did the Israelites pass through? A separation of waters. What do you see in Genesis? A separation of waters. You look at the Tower of Babel, right? What do you see? A massive tower that God shoots down. What happens when they go into Canaan? They see a massive tower. See how this works? If you look at Cain and Abel, one was an agrarian person, one was raising livestock. What was Israel doing in Egypt? They were raising livestock versus the agrarian Egyptians. See how that's working? There's all these allusions taking place, a really complex tapestry, dealing with when Israel went into the Promised Land. It was like going back into a restored creation, while Egypt modeled a fallen creation. There's sort of these neat ties. So the point is that Genesis 1 was probably not meant to be a literal scientific account of what took place. That's kind of what's happening. So that's really important. Let's go to the next slide. In fact, what you find is if you look at modern science, much of modern science was done in Western Europe. Why? Because the Christian faith actually allowed science to take place. Because what does Christianity teach? We believe in a creator that created the world in an orderly fashion, and he created us in his image, right? So that means that you expect there to be orderly laws. And if we're in God's image, it makes sense that we would have the capacity to understand those laws. Not to mention, Genesis talks about going out and subduing the earth. And that's not to misuse it, but the sense of going out, doing science to understand it and to advance. So that Christian framework is fertile soil to allow science to take place. While if you're from a very atheistic perspective, why would you believe that our brain would evolve in such a way to do science? Because evolution shapes us to feed, to fight, to reproduce, to do those different things, but it doesn't shape us to understand the abstract principles that govern our universe. That makes no sense. So really, science and faith are intertwined in a very, very deep way. Next slide. Now, that's the issue of approaches. Let me just stop there. Any questions about that? Comments? So far, so good? No one's fleeing out the door. That's a good sign. Doing good? Understanding? Okay. Now, why is it important? Well, it's because you have to realize, and Aaron spoke about this actually in the sermon in very beautiful ways, is we understand the world through a Christian perspective. That's our narrative. Because again, if you study like philosophy and worldview and epistemology and things like that, it's the whole idea that all of us see the world through a grid. It's like we have a deep operating system in our brain, which is our worldview. It's actually much deeper than that, but it's basically the assumptions that we build our life upon. So like if you use a Macintosh versus a Windows operating system, you don't think about the operating system, do you? You just use Word or Excel. But what happens if you try to install a Microsoft Word program on an Apple? What's going to take place? It's not going to work. In the same way, as Christians, we have a certain operating system that should be shaped by this Christian narrative. We should see the world from the perspective that we are God's creation, that we're restored through the love of God, and we're called by God to restore creation to be partners with Him. That's how we should see our lives. But what happens so often is people have a secular operating system. So when they go to church, they hear stories, they hear sermons, they hear ethics, but it never really connects. Because it's like trying to install a Word operating program on a Macintosh computer. And what's happening so often is when you look at the high schools, you look at the youth, and you look at the culture, so many of our youth are in a culture that's saying that there's a certain story of reality, that you're kind of here by chance, the purpose of life is to be happy and have sex and have fun and buy lots of stuff so that whoever dies with the most toys wins, right? That's our narrative. And what's happened is so many students have embraced that narrative that when they go to church, again, it's like water off a duck's back because their operating system is incompatible with the truth of the gospel. So that's why if you look at statistics, every generation there's a massive decline in church attendance. Like the baby boomers were like 65, X was like 30, the next was like 15, and now we have about 8% of the people, kids, who go to church that end up in church after they finish school. Because again, they don't have a proper operating system. Because again, if you look at the Christian narrative, the idea is that we're created by God, we're designed to experience His love and His kindness and a purpose. Next. But what's happened is because of the rebellion and the fall of creation, essentially, is the idea of moral autonomy. It's the idea that Adam and Eve wanted to be like God, knowing good from evil. They would essentially be masters of their own faith. Be like the Frank Sinatra song, I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to decide for myself what's right and what's wrong. I'm going to tell myself what my purpose in life is. I'm going to do it my way. And if you look at the idea of the rest of Genesis, the idea that because people rebelled against God, there was a dehumanization process that took place. They become less than their full humanity. And then what happened was that brokenness in their lives resulted in the brokenness in the world around us, to the fall of creation. So if you look at all the problems in the world, it goes back to the fact that we're alienated from God, and the implications of that have trickled out. That's sort of that narrative. Now, of course, in the Christian story, there's the idea of redemption. That Christ came into the world to break the power of evil in the world. You all saw Lord of the Rings? You remember when and of course we did. I love that. It's great. That's not always the case where I always So remember when Frodo took the Ring of Power? It's like he kind of put the Ring of Power into Mount Doom, into the lava. What happened was, you remember that whoosh, the power of evil was broken? It's kind of the picture of the resurrection, or the crucifixion, that Jesus took the evil of the world upon Himself. When He died on the cross, that evil was defeated, and He rose from the dead to show that He was the new ruler of creation. And what happens after that is the church is called as His body on earth to restore the world around us. So that's our narrative. And then, of course, the end of the narrative is God will eventually restore all creation to the way it should have been. Now, what's taking place, though, is that narrative has changed. Because during the Enlightenment, what took place is because of a lot of the hypocrisy in the church, and then after the Reformation, Christians were killing each other. There was a bit of a sour feeling about faith. Plus, when science came on the stage in a vengeance which took place, the science was solving people's problems. Like back in the 8th century, if you had eye problems, who would you go to for help? Your priest, probably, right? Your priest would pray for you, and that hopefully would help. But who do we go to if we have eye problems today? Which seems easier. See? So that's what's happened, is as science was explaining more and more issues in solving our problems, we said, we don't need this faith thing. This seems like just a drag with all these wars and everything. So let's redefine reality with a new point of reference. Let's not look to that narrative as our point of reference, but let's look to ourselves. Like, remember Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am? The whole idea was that the epistemological center shifted from God to man. Like, now we can define for ourselves what's true and what's false by our own rationality. And that's the Enlightenment. It's through human reason and science we can make a better world for ourselves. So the narrative changed. In fact, the picture which was often given at that time, again, is that faith was not the source of saving the world, but science was a source of saving the world from faith. And this is a great picture. Here you see Galileo showing the stars and the moon. And there's the Pope wanting to beat Galileo in the head with the telescope. That's kind of that picture. Next. So, of course, evolution came on the scene. Next. And what happened is that there was this shift where before the creation idea is that we're created by God. And then what happened is it shifted with we are simply the product of the blind forces of nature. Now, there are a lot of Christians, like Francis Collins, that argues that evolution was simply a tool that God used. So the point isn't so much, yes?
So there's a problem I have because there's often a conflation with creation and evolution.
Right.
And evolution says nothing at all about creation.
Right, and that's my point, is that people like Francis Collins argue that evolution was the tool that God used. While what someone like Richard Dawkins would say is evolution is a proof that we're not created by a creator, but simply the blind forces of nature. So this issue isn't fundamentally,
It's an inductive proof, it's not necessarily proof.
Well, I'm not saying it's true or even logical, it's just, it is what it is. And again, people don't operate on the level of logic and reason, they operate on the level of narrative usually. So the secular narrative that took place at this time was that we're no longer the product of a creator, but we're simply the product of the blind forces of nature. So that the universe came into being by chance. Well, at that time they thought it was a term, but eventually they thought that the first cell came by chance, that humans evolved by chance, and all social structures in society were simply products of blind chance. That was the narrative. And also, the problem in the world isn't that we're fallen from God, but the problem of the world is you've got all these superstitious religious people that oppress you with all their oppressive morality and their oppressive rules and their greedy priests who always want money and the indulgences and all that. So that's where the narrative is. That the idea is that the fall of humanity is essentially ignorance, superstition, which is often connected to faith. Next slide. And of course, redemption is not in any way connected with what God does, but redemption is essentially human liberation. Maybe you saw the movie Titanic? Yeah, Titanic, there's a really poignant scene in Titanic where Rose goes up to Leonardo DiCaprio. What was his character? Jack? Yeah. And she says, Jack, I'm going to leave with you after the ship lands. Now, why did Rose make that decision? Was it because she was praying and not wanting to help her brother stumble, or she was reading scripture? No. It's because it felt right. Because she was going to liberate herself from the shackles of tradition, the shackles of her parental authority, and it's experienced like sexual freedom and so forth. So that's kind of the narrative of the Enlightenment, that essentially freedom of the human spirit, freedom from religion, freedom from tradition, and freedom to explore science is what's going to save humanity. Education, right? In fact, if you listen to all the political debates, if we can just have a better economy and a better education system, which would be good things, right? We'd all like that. But those aren't the saviors of culture. That won't end racism. That won't end all the problems in the world. So that's the picture. Next. And of course, the final end is not the restoration of creation from God's perspective, but it's a utopia of science and prosperity, hopefully without the dark side of the Force. So that's a picture from Star Wars. So those are the two different narratives. Let's go to the next one. And again, what's really important to realize is we kind of experimented with this, and the challenge is if you look in the early part of our century, people tried to put the Enlightenment project into effect. Like, how can we live in a world without God, without any authority beyond ourselves? And the problem is science, so what scientists often don't realize is the extent to which they're biased by cultural forces. And what happened is, at the earlier part of our century, you have eugenics. And eugenics was simply an attempt to apply Darwinian theory to society. So back in the day, the professors argued that white Europeans were the superior race, everyone else is inferior, and they did not allow people they felt that were genetically inferior to reproduce. There was forced sterilization. It was illegal for different ethnicities to marry each other, and there was lots of other horrible things also. In fact, Hitler's views largely came from the United States, so it kind of spilled over. That's where he got it from, actually. And again, a lot of that is what happens when you have a narrative that science is the only source of truth without any input from higher realities. That's the big challenge. Next slide. In fact, this is a great picture of how science can be perverted. This is Rockefeller talked about how the growth of large businesses was survival of the fittest, how it's a license for predatory behavior. And Carnegie talked about, I remember that the light came in as a flood and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I had found the truth of evolution. And again, the point isn't so much faith against evolution, it's more of faith against the blind watchmaker. That's kind of the big issue. Next slide. And of course, this is a great quote from what's called the Behavior Science Teacher Education Project. And it says, it calls for the impersonal manipulation through schooling of the future America in which a few will be able to maintain control over their opinions. An America in which each individual receives at birth a multi-purpose identification number, which enables employers to keep track of underlings. It's kind of this survival of the fittest applied to education. It talks about how chemical experimentation on minors would be normal procedure in the post-1967 world, and the future in which a small elite will control all important matters, and education would focus on pleasure, cultivation, and other attitudes and skills compatible with a non-woke world. So again, you see this whole idea of a rational. This was the 60s. This was actually an official report by an education project in Michigan. So again, this
in the 60s.
Yeah.
Of 1900.
Yeah, 1900s. And again, it's that same thing of eugenics and applying that ideas to education. So again, next slide. So again, this is sort of a picture of why the issue of faith in science is important. What's the question?
It's the slides missing.
Oh, what was it?
There's no last slide.
Oh, no, I mean, that's fine. That was the lesson.
Oh,
But that
okay.
wasn't the lesson. Sorry, my bad. And again, that's why the whole issue of faith in science is important, because it's not so much just that you've got evolutionary theory, which is a scientific idea, which we can talk about, but it's the idea that you've got a narrative where evolution has become the creation narrative of that secular worldview, essentially. And what's happened is, you know, people in high school, and I have friends who are high school teachers, and the high school teachers don't teach science from the perspective, like Francis Collins would, that there's kind of, you know, there's the idea of a creation, a creator that works in different ways, but it's really this whole idea of the blind watchmaker, that we're the product of the blind forces of nature, and because of that, we have to choose our own ethics, our own morality, and build society with our own rationality. And that's how students are being taught often, and that's their mindset. It's not very sophisticated, but it's very problematic. And I can tell you fun stories about that. So it's really important to understand how to talk about faith in science, not purely in the academic sense, but how it really relates to these narratives. And how, if you look at science properly, it's not in conflict with faith, but it actually supports faith. So that's part two. Any questions or comments? Yes?
The issue is that, as Einstein put it, either one of those two areas by themselves, thinking they know everything, is basically an act of hubris.
Right, right.
And the difficulty we have in the United States is teachers in the public school system can't really talk about the faith component of it, because that implies that the government is supporting this faith view, and you know, and so they can't do that, and they're kind of in an impossible position. It strikes me, and I don't know how we solve that except in churches, where you tell kids there's this other component, and they have to talk about what you're talking about.
Yeah, and again, that's what's really frustrating to me is, particularly if you're in more conservative churches, there really is not the passion to talk about faith and culture in general. Like, what does it mean as Christians? How do we see science? How do we see politics? How do we see social justice? Because a lot of Christianity has become very escapist, very Gnostic. It's the idea that the purpose of Christianity is to pray a prayer to get saved, and then you go to heaven. And you teach other people to teach other people how to pray a prayer and go to heaven. It's very escapist. There isn't this sense of, didn't you read N.T. Wright at all?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So there isn't this, it's a fun crowd. So again, there isn't this sense of the gospel starts with the transformation of the individual, but it spreads to the restoration of creation. That view is not there. So part of it's a deep, deep theological poverty in many churches. That's a foundational problem. But then there's also the intimidation to talk about it in meaningful terms. So you're right, you're absolutely right. Any more comments? Yes?
It seems to me that with these two spheres of science and theology, that the real argument is over control. And if you go back to Galileo's time, there was the Pope wanted control over science. And you have this situation where theologians want control over science, and science wants control over theology.
Yeah, that's a beautiful narrative. Yeah.
So what are the science of control over theology?
Well, you read Richard Dawkins, read Hitchens, read like a lot of this.
Practicing science.
Right.
In my mind.
Yes.
True. In fact, your average scientist wants to do their experiment, and again, the academy can be very, like most scientists. When you go for a Ph.D., will you have a Ph.D.? Okay. You know how you go for a Ph.D. Typically, you focus on a simple project. Like it's laser focused on some small issue. So most scientists are looking at like the minutiae, but then you've got a few of the people like Stephen Jay Gould actually do this, and Richard Dawkins, all these folks, that then will take the authority of science and use it to present philosophy. And the problem is they don't, and it's really like a great example of this. I don't know if you're familiar with Lawrence Krauss. Okay, he's a cosmologist. He's sort of one of the big hot shots on the atheist scene these days. And also Stephen Hawkins, I'm sure you've heard of. And they argue now that science has shown that God is not relevant. Science has shown that the universe can come from nothing. And it's a beautiful, this is actually a beautiful, beautiful book talking about cosmology. It's a beautiful book. He's a really good teacher. He has a YouTube video too that puts on. But what he does, and this is the same thing that Stephen Hawkins does, is they'll talk about very clear science, well supported, not necessarily everyone believes it, but at least it's reasonable, and they'll seamlessly transition to philosophy, and the average public has no idea when that transition takes place. And they'll say, now that we know that this is true and this is true, we can say that we don't need God, that the universe came from nothing. We're simply the forces of the blind force of nature and some vacuum energy. And that's the challenge.
Because there's no science.
There's no science, but the public can't tell the difference.
That's just it. It's intelligent.
Yeah, you're not the average person. I'm sorry.
You think doctors, you think scientists, and like he's so bright and he's got it.
When I made that comment, what was in the back of my mind was that a lot of religious people will immediately quote Dawkins, Carl Sagan, and people like this. And when they make pronouncements about God, they're not dealing with science. They're outside of their realm.
Right.
And I think that's appropriate to stay within your realm.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And again, people have to know where their realms end.
Right.
And then there has to be thoughtful discussion in the middle. I think people that are in the community know that some of the most exciting research is cross-disciplinary. You cross out of your boundary, look at the fuzzy boundaries. It's when really interesting discussion takes place. So you do have people like Polkinghorne and people like that are having some really neat discussions about faith and science and what it look like. But that's the minority. And people listen to the extremes, those who are yelling the loudest the most. And again, it's sort of the fallacy of the excluded middle is the big challenge. And it was the same thing historically. Like you talk about slavery, you talk about this or that. People are always screaming who didn't really know what they're talking about. And it's sort of the middle approach, which was very thoughtful and wise. It's very Anglican to be a maybe that's what that being Anglican. Is often lost in the discussion. It's the same thing with gay issues. Like people are shouting at each other, and they never deal with the nuance of how do we understand all this stuff in a very passionate, thoughtful, and wise way. It just doesn't happen that much because you're drowned out by it. It's the same thing. So the challenge is, though, if you talk to the average Joe on the street, like I work with students, that's what I do is I talk to students. The students, what they're hearing is that science and faith are hopelessly in conflict. That's the research, that's what students believe, and they have to choose either faith or science. That's what they believe. And that's wrong, right? That's wrong.
That's wrong from both perspectives.
It is, but that's what they believe. That is why a lot of students are leaving the church. Just this reality.
It seems the real problem is, as you said, the people on the edges are screaming because they are screaming simple-minded things.
Yeah.
Simple, simple, simple. People can understand simple, but in the middle is where it isn't simple. When you actually have to know something.
Yeah, exactly right.
And nobody is actually providing the information to actually know something, because to actually know something, you have to blend these two things, and you have this huge problem. Who's going to teach you what? And you don't know who's the expert, because you got a bunch of people who claim to be experts, sometimes expert in our area, and now suggest that they're an expert in another, which is kind of what you're getting at, and they're not always. So you got good scientists who imply something that's, and they don't make it clear. Well, now here's what science says, and now some people think that, and they don't separate those two. They make it like it's all obvious conclusions, and it's not true.
It works in both worlds too. Like what you said about control is absolutely right. In fact, when I was talking to Meredith, you all know Meredith, I think. But she works in the publishing industry, and a Catholic friend once commented that in many Protestant circles, the publishing industry has become the magisterium of the church. So, like, you don't understand the magisterium in the Catholic Church. You've got the official theologians and folks that determine doctrine. In more of your popular Christian world, it's the big authors that define what's true and what people should think. Like it's the Joel Osteens, it's the...
Just opinion, I think.
It's true.
That's the way the world, the American culture works in other areas as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. Go back to that slide from 67.
Yeah, exactly right.
This is a whole different topic, and we may not get into it, but when you were talking about that we're created in God's image, and therefore we have, it's not so bizarre for us to think, to expand and to progress and that sort of thing. I also think that some of the issues going on with youth, I even deal with it, even at this point. And in our gospel readings, we're getting into, after Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, the Holy Spirit You know, so I've begun to think about the Holy Spirit as being, you know, God within me. And therefore, when I do what may be considered my own will, you know, who's to say that I'm, you know, how can you say, oh, I'm just following my own will instead of following the will of God? To me, that is the will of God working through me.
Good. That's excellent. That's excellent.
And I think the kids, you know, being young, if they're being told, oh, well, that's your will, you're not doing God's will, well, how do you know what's God's will versus...
Great question. Boy, I almost felt like that was just like planted. And again, when Jesus talked about the Holy Spirit, Jesus talked about who would the Holy Spirit always testify about? What would the Holy Spirit be speaking about in its focus? It testifies of me, right? Of
yeah.
truth, of me.
Okay.
And that's why the whole idea, remember I talked about the operating system?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Because what happens is you look at and again, if you want to go into more of like Paul in Ephesians talking about principalities and powers, that's not my expertise. I know nothing about that sort of stuff, but let's pretend I do. If you want to work at that level, even Paul, like there's that fascinating verse, I think it's in Corinthians, talks about how I battle not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers. And he talks about how he takes every argument and pretension and defeats it. And it's this interlinking of ideologies and spirituality, which is fascinating. I don't understand it, but let me pretend I do. If you think about it in those terms, this cosmic battle against the power of evil, the power of good, the spirituality, there's a different spirit enlivening action in people's lives. It's either the Holy Spirit or the spirit of this age. And it's interesting that Paul demythologizes it. So like in that time period, people love to talk about angels and demons and all this other stuff and had all hierarchies. Paul just says, don't worry about it. There's this evil stuff out here, but we be faithful Christians, and that's how we pose it. It's this interesting picture. That's another story. Margaret Dawn writes about that in her books. But the idea is that the spirit of the age is driven by narrative. It's driven by story. In the secular culture, lots of beautiful things about it, but one of the problems with it is the narrative is a narrative that doing it your way is doing it the way of Madison Avenue. Like what you want is American Idol. I love the title of that TV show because it's so honest. American Idol. I mean, let's no pretense.
Right.
You know, you're a good person if you're beautiful and rich and talented. If you're not that, you're worthless in society. That's the narrative, right? And that's what Madison Avenue uses. You have to buy my product, you know, drive this car, whatever, to be a good person. So that's the spirit of this age which is driving people. It's a spirit of individualism, and it's a selfish individualism. It's like it's about me, it's about my will, my desires. I'm not going to worry about my fellow person. Who cares about the poor down the street? Who cares about social injustice, as long as I'm happy? Versus the spirit of Christ, which is the opposite of what you talked about. The spirit of the world is about control, it's about domination. It's that Nietzschean idea of the will to power. The spirit of Christ is about empowering others. The spirit of Christ is about taking the beauty inside of a human being and bringing that to its fullness. So when we say it's this, really Jesus said it this way: you can't serve two masters. You either serve Christ or you serve men. He also talked about how my yoke is easy, my burden is light. The yoke is this picture of a slavery to Christ, that Paul talked himself as a slave to Christ. So the issue is we are going to submit to some spirit. We are going to submit to some narrative, like which is it? And that's the challenge we have to address. That makes sense. So and what's interesting too is this whole idea that when we do our will, because we're involved with the disciplines, we're reading scripture, we go to this. In fact, the whole idea of the liturgy is that we're experiencing the whole Christian narrative in one Sunday. Is that our hearts get so shaped that our will and Christ's will become so intertwined that we can't even tell the difference. So we may have a desire, which is our desire, but that might be so intertwined with the Spirit's working that we can't even tell. In contrast, you look at Paul talking about quenching the Spirit. When we give in to selfishness and unforgiveness, and we give in to all those other things, we say, the Spirit of Christ, stay away from me, while you embrace the Spirit of this world. That's kind of the idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any more comments? Okay, let's go to the second part of the third part of the presentation. Let me just switch it. Oh no, gosh, you're awesome. She's amazing. She's so amazing as well. Yeah. Erin and her make such a great couple. Okay, let's go to the next one. And now I'm going to talk quickly about a few different interfaces of, say, faith and science. this next slide is going to talk about cosmology and about astronomy. Because what's fascinating is what people realize is that the laws of physics seem to have been fine-tuned to allow life to exist. In fact, it is still really crazy that we can do physics, right? I mean, if you study chemistry or physics, aren't they simple equations? I mean, you can write them in one line. You know, you've got like your equilibrium constant. I mean, yeah, of course it gets real ugly when we go into the details, but the fundamental ones aren't so bad, right? Like the Schrodinger's equation is pretty simple, right? Well,
You never solved one.
yeah, you can't solve it except in one dimension, but the point is the fundamental laws of physics you can write on a napkin, like most of them, right? Like if you're familiar with, you're familiar with them, with like Maxwell's equations, like that shirt and all this stuff. And it's really creepy that it actually works. Like if you were going to take a random set of equations and try to base the universe on them, the chances of you having a stable universe are virtually nil. Like chemistry is based on Schrodinger's equation, which is nuts. Crazy how that works. And then if you look at the laws of physics, like gravity and electromagnetism, if you were to adjust these laws, like make gravity greater or smaller, life wouldn't exist. If the strong nuclear force, which holds your protons and neutrons together, weren't just right, life would not exist. No life. In fact, if you look at the universe, you know how our universe is expanding? I'm glad you know, that's cool. Yeah, the whole Hubble's constant. What's crazy is the expansion has to be just right to like 1 part in 10 to the 20th or something, or life would not exist. So everything looks like it was designed with life in mind. That points to a creator. It's really extraordinary. It's called the anthropic principle. There's lots of cool terms. And let's go to the next slide. Also, if you look at the Earth, where we are in the galaxy is just right for life. Because if we were too close to the center, we'd be blasted by radiation. If we were too far from the center, there wouldn't be enough materials to produce the Earth that we need. We're right between a spiral arm in an area without a lot of dust, so we don't get contaminated by different things, and we can actually do observations. Let's go to the next thing. If you look at, again, I mentioned that, the next one. If you look at the mass of the Earth, if the mass of Earth was too small, we wouldn't have enough atmosphere because it would escape. If it was too large, we would have too much carbon dioxide. So the mass is just right to allow for life. Next slide. We have plate tectonics. If plate tectonics did not exist, we would not be able to recycle a lot of materials that allow life to exist. Next slide. If you look at how weird it is, you all know the story of how the moon came about. The common theories there was an asteroid that hit the Earth and created lots of, that's what allows us to have plate tectonics and a nice moon. Next. If that weren't just right, life would not exist. The water content is just right to moderate our temperatures. Next. In fact, the very nature of water, if water did not float when it was frozen, life would not exist. Because that allows it to recirculate the ocean, right? If it froze from the bottom up, that would be really bad for us. Not to mention many other properties. If the tilt of the Earth was not just right, we wouldn't have life in the abundance that we have. If it was too extreme, the temperatures would fluctuate too much. If it was too not as much, it would just bake the center and freeze the tops. The Earth's moon's amazing too. Next. What happens is it prevents the wind speeds from being about 1,000 miles per hour. Next. It also stabilizes the tilt of our axis so that we have a stable environment. Next. Our sun is just right also, because you have a lot of different types of suns, and this particular sun is stable and it produces the right type of radiation that allows life to exist. Like we like radiation visible in the infrared, but if it's like too low or too high, that's problematic. And it's just right. And our atmosphere actually lets the right radiation through also, which is amazing. Next. And again, if it was too massive, it would have burned out. And if it was less massive, we would have been so close to the sun, we would have phase locked, so it would have baked the surface of our Earth. Next slide. The planets are great. Next. Because if we didn't have Jupiter or Saturn, we'd probably hit by more asteroids, which would cause a lot of problems. So they kind of protect us from the asteroids. And then, of course, that's the idea of cosmology. Now, when we get into biology, and again, I won't get into the issue about evolution or not in this particular talk, but regardless of the process that you believe produced life, what you see is design in nature in some beautiful ways. Like we have this thing called a flagellum, which is a tail like a propeller that spins. Next slide. It's an amazing thing because it's kind of the representation of the outer cell membrane. Next, it spins about 17,000 RPMs or much, much faster. It can switch directions in a quarter of a turn. Next slide. Liquid cooled. Next. Acid drive. I feel like I'm selling a car. And here's sort of a schematic of it. And again, when you look at the design in biology, whether it be the cell at large or these molecular machines, what's amazing about it is they don't look like human machines. They are exactly like human machines, almost to the very details. They don't use metal. They use biological chemicals, proteins. But the logical operations, you can almost make a point-by-point comparison to a human-designed machine, which is pretty extraordinary. In fact, the more biologists study microbiology, and particularly cellular biology, what they find is the same logic behind human construction, human feedback loops, and so forth, is exactly the same as you see in biology. So there's this evidence of the creator at that level.
Those two previous slides, were they?
Oh, that? Oh, yeah. This is like a side section of your flagellum. Just,
Yeah, it does look like your car that you're selling.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That's like the acid. That's like the engine kind of spins around, and then the next is the schematic of it. But I mean, it's extraordinary. In fact, the more biologists look at the cell, the more they have to go to human design engineering principles, because it's the same logic, which is pretty extraordinary. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the last interesting intersection of faith and science is what I call the Shroud of Turin. Who's heard of the Shroud of Turin? Okay, who's familiar with the carbon dating? Who knew the carbon dating was discounted? A few people, yeah. So you're up on this. Wow, you're totally up on this.
Carbon dating was discounted to how many years?
What's that?
To how many years?
No, it was discredited. It didn't work.
On that shroud.
Yeah, and I'll explain.
Can you give context to what the shroud is?
Yeah, what's happening to the shroud is, if you look at it, it's the burial cloth of Christ. Remember when Joseph Arimathea gave the cloth to Jesus to be buried? This is kind of what the cloth looks like. It wraps over the front of Jesus, around the head, and around the back. So it's like, yeah, so it wraps him. It's about 4 meters long, about 1 meter wide, made of linen, flax. And what happened is after the resurrection, there was an image on the cloth. Next. And here's the actual shroud. Now, ignore this. This is like from a burn much, much later. Like the shroud was in a box, and the church caught on fire, and the box melted and burned a hole through the shroud. It was folded in 8 pieces. So these are the burn marks. Here's some of the scorch marks, and there are nuns that sewed up patches. So ignore that. But what you see on the shroud is you have medical evidence. Like here's the face, the front of the head. Here's the front of the body, the legs. Here's the back of the head, the back of the body. And what you see on the shroud is basically medical evidence of a crucifixion. You see puncture wounds in the head, and the blood stains match what you'd expect from a puncture wound from the crown of thorns. You see a spear wound in the side, or there's a separation of blood serum and blood and water, as John talks about it. You see scourge marks on the back and the front. You see lacerations from the crossbeam. You see a dislocated nose. So basically, every single detail described in the Gospels is portrayed on the shroud as you'd expect it. So that's pretty extraordinary. Next slide. Here's the scourge marks. Next slide. Let's go back one. But what's really amazing is not so much the medical evidence, but a faint body image which is left over when you ignore the medical evidence. And what happened is this was studied by scientists in the 70s in the Stirrup team. And it actually acts a lot like a photographic negative. Like if here's the shroud image, and the photographic negative is a better slide, it would actually be clear. Because the image on the shroud was actually produced by an oxidation dehydration process, which would be similar if you took a shirt in the sun. You know how a shirt would yellow? Because the radiation from the sun would chemically alter the surface of the shirt. That's what produced the image on the shroud, not the sun, but radiation. Because what you find on the shroud is that there's a layer, it's only a few microns thick, very, very thin, of a chemical change of the surface fibers from radiation. What's extraordinary about it is the high resolution. Like there's high resolution of the face, of the beard, of the arms, and so forth. Which means that it seemed like there were millions of lasers that left the body and burned an image onto the shroud during the resurrection. Now, technically, let's go to the next slide. Technically, it's more like a coronal discharge. Like if you charge up a bulb to a very high voltage, you get electric discharge, and that will produce in the cloth a singe mark. And this has been reproduced actually by scientists, not the resurrection, but the coronal discharge. And what they find is that the chemical signatures is virtually identical. In fact, if you look at the eye area of the shroud, you can actually see a coin. Because when people died in shock, they put coins on their eyes so their eyelids wouldn't stay open. And the coin on the shroud actually dates back to 29 AD in the area of Jerusalem. So the shroud is actually self-dating. But what's even more interesting, let's go to the next slide, is if you look at the image of the wrists on the shroud, next, and of the face of the shroud, and this is in the three-dimensionally enhanced mode, like if you take the image of the shroud and the photographic negative and offset it, it creates a three-dimensional image. But what you find is the face of the shroud, this is the shroud, this is simply a skeleton from a textbook. As you can actually see the orbits of the eye, you can see the nasal cavities, you can actually see the teeth and the roots of the teeth. Now what's taking place here, that's not because of decomposition. Because the body on the shroud is in rigor mortis, but not decomposition. So what you end up with is partly this electric discharge from the surface of the body, which produced part of the image, and X-rays from within the body that produce the X-ray image. Now the only way to really explain that is that the atoms in the body of Christ came apart, the strong nuclear force was overcome, which would have caused the electrons to change orbitals, which would produce X-rays, and then go to the surface to produce a coronal discharge. It's fairly obvious if you have a Ph.D. in physics. But the point
That's the reason I'm having trouble understanding it.
The point is, what happened apparently during the resurrection is the body dematerialized in that process, released energy that produced the coronal discharge and the X-ray image. So it's like the videotape of the resurrection. Now, the amount of energy to do that would be about 100 million volts. So that's more of the potential difference in about a tenth of a second to produce the one image. And then you need a small nuclear bomb to deal with the atom. So that's kind of what's happening. So again, this
so
is...
then why wouldn't it destroy the small nuclear bomb?
Because it was a controlled reaction. Because what happened is the energy took apart the atoms, but it wasn't excessive enough to burn the shroud. In fact, when this was done by high voltage experts, what they found is to produce the image, the voltage had to be just right. Because if it was too high, you would burn the shroud. If it was too low, it wouldn't give an image. The timing had to be just right, like a tenth of a second. Because it was too fast, it would burn the image. It was too slow, it would have left the image. So this is basically like a videotape of the resurrection, which was deliberately left behind, what I would argue, for our generation.
What year was that study done?
What's that?
What year was that study done?
70s?
Because I'm pretty sure there's been more recent stuff done.
Yes, there's actually, they've actually been able to create a hologram of it. That's kind of interesting. There was, I think, a guy in South America that actually produced a hologram off the image. There's also Dr. Wenger, who's the guy Gal is from. He's one of the world expert on this sort of stuff. They've actually found pollens on it, which was studied during the 70s, but they've identified the pollens to flowers. Dr. Danin, who's the world expert on the flowers of Jerusalem, has indicated there's about 20 images of flowers on it, which match the pollen. And the only place in the world where those combinations of flowers exist is around Jerusalem area, the Palestine area.
So I thought there was a mid-80s study that indicated this as well.
Well, there is a carbon dating, but the problem was that...
Yeah,
What was
it
it?
wasn't carbon dating.
What was it?
I don't know if it was XRF or what on the actual stains to determine they weren't blood.
Oh, okay, yeah. Dr. McCrone. Dr. McCrone was the only dissenter of the Stirrup team. He argued that there was like a pigment used to produce the blood stains. The problem with McCrone is he's actually on the board of the Skeptic magazine before he died. And he acknowledged he never looked at the contrary evidence. Because what happened is during the Middle Ages, what they would do is take the shroud image and touch it to paintings to give it more value. Kind of like buying Michael Jordan's shoes, I see. And what happened is there are small traces of material that transmitted from the painting to the shroud. But there was such a small amount that McCrone found that it couldn't possibly explain the image. Plus Alan Adler, who is an expert on the chemistry of blood, showed that it was real blood, type AB. So that's been thoroughly discredited.
So, can you describe, so then Christ was walking.
Well, what happened is the idea of the resurrection is not a resuscitation. That's important to realize. A resuscitation was like Lazarus come out of your tomb.
Yes.
He died, He stopped breathing, he started breathing, he walked.
Yes.
The resurrection is completely different. Because the whole idea of the resurrection, and the Jews believed in it, they just didn't believe what happened in history, is that your body is transformed. Paul talks about that, where it has both a physical and a spiritual reality. So this N.T. Wright talks about this, how the resurrection is a foreshadowing of the full restoration of creation, which is exciting. So again, his body literally dematerialized. Well, we don't know exactly what happened. It's really hard to reproduce resurrections in labs. But the best we can tell,
Take care.
is give it a shot. Yeah, try to get funding for that. But as best we can tell, the body dematerialized, went to heaven, wherever, however that works. With the, that's not my experience. But those creeds actually are kind of complex enough. But whatever happened, he vanished, he dematerialized, and then he rematerialized, as far as we can tell, later. That's it.
So he was transported.
Yeah, like a Starship Enterprise transporter.
And that's the only, I mean, this atoms falling apart wouldn't have been a small nuclear bomb. That would have been a huge nuclear bomb.
Yeah, it'd be pretty serious.
It would completely destroy the tomb.
Yeah.
It would have destroyed Jerusalem.
Yeah. So again, if you're a Christian, it kind of fits with the resurrection, because you got a guy around Jerusalem about 30 AD who, you know, was dead for about 1 to 2 days and suddenly dematerialized. It kind of fits a resurrection, right? But if you're not a Christian, then there are other explanations. Some have proposed aliens, time travelers, Starship Enterprise. So it's kind of no, I'm serious. I'm totally serious. People believe this. People believe this. That Jesus was essentially kind of an alien messenger. That's what happened.
I was not aware that carbon-14 had been disproved. as
Right.
you
What
say.
happened?
When
Okay. What happened? There were several issues with it.
John's morning.
What's that?
I said it just ruined John's morning.
Oh.
No, not that.
So what happened was there was a couple issues. One of the issues was the dating was done on a corner, and there was a seam sewn in for much later. Remember because they sewed it to a backflush.
Yeah, right.
And what happened was those fibers, because they were much later, contaminated the sample. And there's an article by Ray Rogers, I think about maybe 5 years ago, that showed that the sample that was taken was chemically different from the rest of the trial. That's why it was discredited. There was also the issue that was in a fire. Like when they went to the church burned down, the fire could have chemically bonded younger carbon to the clean tube. But whatever the case may be, there's an image of a coin that goes in 29 AD in Jerusalem. So that's pretty clear data. Oh, plus
You can see the coin here.
no, I should have. If you like, you want to pull it up? You want to see the coin?
So we have to end the presentation.
Well, let's make this will be the end. So thank you very much. And if you want to stay on to say the coin, you're welcome to see the coin.